Morning, everyone. My name is Mar Medina, and I will be presenting my research entitled Weaving Indigenous Mathematics Alongside Maya Elders in Belize. So the outline for this presentation will focus on three parts. First, I will discuss conventional views and treatment of mathematics. Second, I will discuss my research, giving an overview. Third, I will be discussing a reimagining of mathematics. So the first part, conventional view of math. We, for the most part, have this view of math as being universal. There's a single universal logic governing all thought. It is often viewed as immutable, impeccable, and irrefutable. For example, the irrefutable certainty that if I write 2 plus 2, the answer is 4. If I write the number 2, 4, 6, then logically the next number in the sequence is 8. And this has been, for the most part, people's view and experiences, and this is how math is treated in schools. Students are taught a single approach towards a single answer, that is just one answer, and there's only a few steps that you need to memorize to get that answer. So generally, math is presented as body-free, culture-free, and history-free. Therefore, a logical question to ask is, but is math truly absolute and ahuman? Can you learn it without using your body? Is it without culture? Is it without history? Early in my research, when I was exploring this notion of culture and math, I came to recognize that in Central America, math does not begin with the European missionaries. It begins over 2,000 years ago with our ancestors, the Maya. And there is recorded evidence in history of this case. As you can see here, we have 4 surviving Maya books called codices. They're named after the location where they were, quote unquote, discovered. We have here the Paris Codex, the Madrid Codex, and we have the Dresden Codex and also the Greuler Codex. One of the things that you could look at here with the Greuler Codex is the number system that the Maya utilized. Many people are familiar with this number system, the way it works. The Maya invented the notion of zero. They counted in groups of 20, meaning units, 20s, 400s, 8,000s. They're always counting by multiple or powers of 20s. My research, in a nutshell, my study argues that an exploration of indigenous math, ways of knowing, doing, and being through culture-based practices of Maya elders can enact and create a more enlivening and empowering mathematics curriculum. I use the term weaving as a metaphor to conceptualize math as a fabric of intertwined concepts. I use it as a means to explore specific mathematical knowing in and through these strands of cultural fibers. My study argues that mathematics, far from being immaterial and disembodied, meaning absolute, abstract, and eternal, is rather deeply material, human, and cultural. I use sensory ethnography, meaning the senses, as my core methodology to explore and study contemporary Maya practices by paying close attention to the sensory experiences, ways of experiencing, and ways of knowing and being. This sensory ethnographic study focuses on learning through the embodied, enacted ecological knowledge of the Maya that has been cultivated through generations in close contact with nature. This study uses contemporary practices to contextualize and explore indigenous Maya mathematics. The way I carried out my research was that I documented and interpreted participants' way of knowing, reasoning, and sensory experiences through participant observations, on-course conversations. So we would walk and discuss and dialogue, whether it was in the rainforest or weaving a basket or just sitting together and talking or enjoying the sunset. I use photography, I use participants' collaborative work. I did partake in a lot of these practices as well, and my own personal field. At its heart, my study explores mathematics as a creative, cultural, and human form of expression. It is a journey of discovery and a spiritual world. What I will present now to you are these thematic themes that I have that has emerged from my time walking alongside my elders. And one of the ones that I very fond of is this one that I've titled Into the Rainforest, experiencing experiencing time as cyclical. In our Western world, we view not math, but time as being linear. If you look at the calendar, there's 30 days to an average of 30 days to every month, 365 days. But there's something about being placed in a setting like the rainforest that allows you to experience time in cycles. For the Maya, if you look at the way they plant corn, the milpa system is imbued with a lot of cycles. One of the things that I got to experience by being in the rainforest, spending time with my elders, you could observe certain things around you. You could sense the change in temperature. You could sense when it's midday. You could sense when the sun is setting. Your notion of time is sort of more of an embodied experience rather than an abstract concept. This notion of cycles became very apparent to me by being in this setting. When you think about math and how we view math, it's always seen as these topics that are very linear. We don't often treat them as being connected and part of a larger cycle. This also became more apparent to me when I spent time with my elders in the Milpa, and what I titled this topic here, this theme is called Milpa Math. And one of the ones that was really captivating for me was what I have titled Dance of the Maize Farmer. And how this works, I will discuss this a little bit so that you could have a more contextualized view of what I mean by this. I view the way the farmer plants his corn as a mathematical dance ritual. And here's what it looks like. The farmer starts at the far end of his field, so he would poke a hole through the white ash with a dibble stick. In his other hand, he takes a small handful of seeds. Usually these seeds average 5 from his waste bag, and reverently and gracefully drops them into the earth. The farmer then takes one step forward, leaving his other foot planted behind, pokes another hole, and gently drops his seed into the earth. He repeats this rhythmic pattern along an imaginary line. Right step, a hole, seeds. Left step, a hole, seeds. Right step, a hole, seeds, and so on. After reaching the end of a line, the boundaries of his field, the farmer turns around and begins planting along a new line in the opposite direction. For me, this became quite interesting because observing it and even partaking in it, you recognize that it is a performance piece of sorts. It is a performance that incorporates rhythmic movement, but much more than that, it is very sacred. I call it sacred because through this very practice that has existed for millennia, the farmer is literally and figuratively walking in the footsteps of our ancestors. Other notions that came out of this context was cycles, the notion of nothingness. You have to clear the land and it almost looks like it's decay and dying, but then within a few cycles, there's life and food. This also provides a source of food for animals that are nearby. The notion of oneness, two-ness, even, odd, when the farmer is stepping forward and moving along the line, you could actually embody that notion of something being even, something being odd. There's certainly order and structure to this form of knowing. The other one that I explored was also certain weaving practices. And this is core and central to my writings because I conceptualize weaving as a metaphor. It was only by engaging and walking alongside my elders and going through these processes of doing and being that I walked away with a new view of math. This one, we can see that the farmer is thatching the roof, but there are very specific patterns to it that if you study it, it's not arbitrary. The roof, the way they thatch the roof is very structured and ordered. Here are a few sketches of what I attempted to analyze alongside my elders. You can see him in the right-hand side showing me how this weaving process works. At the bottom was our collaboration in terms of trying to formalize what that looks like. But another thing that you must recognize is that when you think about cultural math, it is not textbook math. It is a different form of math. It is one that has to be experienced to be appreciated. The other one that I also looked at was the basket weaving. A lot of us are familiar with baskets in Belize. We see them at the market squares from these artisans, these weavers. But one of the things that I was very captivated by was that the process that they utilized is not just random. It is much more than that. It's much more cultural. There are specific times of the year that you can harvest these reinforced plant fibers. They're hand processed. There's a whole step-by-step approach to it. But when they begin to weave sort of in this spiral representation, you could actually feel certain number counts that you are doing. And it is a very meticulous process that allows you to consciously pay attention to these certain patterns and these in and out weaving. The notion of even and odd also came out of this for me. You're moving through the specific patterns and the fibers almost guides your fingers in that. A colleague of mine who's also a mathematician has been exploring the primes, and it's quite interesting how George Aldana, represented the prime numbers, the way they behave, sort of in this spiral pattern. And when I recognized it, I was, wait a minute, when you're thinking about weaving in sort of a spiral pattern formation, those numbers become alive. They take on new meaning for you. And so that was quite captivating, as these two can present a link between cultural, tangible, tactile math versus the dry, black and white, abstract written one that we are familiar with and can be very off-putting to learners. The other one here you can see are more examples of basket weaving. And as I mentioned, one of the core things about my research is that I utilize weaving as a means to look at indigenous forms of knowing and being and contextualize it. These practices have existed for thousands of years. And one of the things that is really quite interesting is that what this does is that it presents a medium for learners of math, even experienced mathematician, to explore math in and through these strands of cultural fiber. I call them cultural fiber because they're imbued with deep esoteric meaning of Maya life. It is not just to be taken as what math can I extract from this practice. It is much more about connecting them as a whole. The other one that I also explored was textile patterns. We look at embroidery and the backstrap looming. Now, the process is a very complex one. Many visitors and Belizeans are familiar with these colorful fabrics, but much more than being aesthetically beautiful, they actually have very specific symbolic meaning for the Maya people and the weavers who engage in these sort of practices. Here, what I will present to you is just a quick snapshot of this looming process. And if you look at the left-hand side, you'll notice very specific patterns. These are not arbitrary and far from being colorful and aesthetically pleasing to the eye. As I've mentioned, they're very symbolic and possess deep meaning of Maya culture. It is a way of life that has survived the test of time, and you can observe the various shapes that are used. For example, we have the intertwining shape, we have the cornstalk shape, we have the spiral. The spiral, if you were to count the number of lines, it actually comes up to 11. These numbers are not arbitrary. When you think about the number 11, that's a prime number. And what we can see here is there's specific counts that are carried out that are that is a form of knowing that's part of the weaver. They're not doing this almost by accident or out of the blue. They're really paying close attention to the process that's going on. And if you look at concepts in math, we could talk about symmetry, isosymmetries. We could talk about these number patterns that can arise from just going through these motions of weaving. One of the things you must understand is that this, even though it looks here as very beautiful, it is a very time-consuming process, but that hard work that goes into it actually helps to create humility. A lot of the weavers that I met are very humble weavers. It can sometimes take up to 6 months to complete a single project. And again, what was very captivating to me was not only the patterns that come along with it, but that the mat that these weavers are using is an embodied form of knowing. It is very intrinsic to what they do, and certainly requires a tremendous amount of patience. The very essence of this process, as I've mentioned, allowed me to conceptualize a new view and treatment of mat as a colorful fabric of intertwined concepts that allows us to deeply understand the world around us and ourselves. I argue that by deliberately and consciously paying attention and touching each thread, each fiber, our understanding of numbers, patterns, symmetry becomes much more profound. On the right-hand side, you could see a picture depicting what this process looks like. And it is a very meticulous process. If you look at the sketch that I did right next to it, every strand of fiber will be touched by this weaver. The pattern that they're going to create will be touched by their hands. And again, what I want to emphasize is that these indigenous forms of knowing and of being and doing, as I have come to study them, have existed for thousands of years, and it's quite interesting to see them still being utilized today. The sketch at the bottom right-hand corner, you could see the pattern if you would look at it from left to right. I've coded it. The O means over, U means under. So there's a very specific pattern to this weaving technique. It's a very intrinsic weaving technique that is utilized. So it's almost looks like under, over, under, over, under, over, and it's very circular as well. So as I've mentioned, these practices lend for a more visceral felt experience of concepts that can be embodied. And I dedicate this presentation to the Maya people of Belize, my elders, and especially the Maya women and children.